During the Second World War, kitchens fell silent. Chimneys stopped smoking. Oil ran dry. But the hunger didn't wait. Across frozen farms, bombed cities, and blacked-out villages, families still found ways to cook, not with gas, not with flame, but with what the earth and memory allowed. Bricks were heated beneath bedsheets. Ash pits replaced ovens. Meals were steamed with hay, cooked in clay, and left to simmer without smoke. These weren't tricks. They were tools, shaped by desperation, refined by repetition. Modern cooking depends on thermostats, timers, and heat on demand. But in 1943, heat wasn't guaranteed. Firewood was confiscated, oil was bartered away, and the stove, once central, became irrelevant. What mattered was warmth, wherever it could be found, and the skill to make food edible when nothing else worked. Families didn't cook for flavor. They cooked for survival. Quietly, carefully, and often without light. These are 7 forgotten WWII cooking hacks, used when there was no stove, no oil, and no firewood. And they still work wherever the flame has gone out. Number 1. Bricktop cooking. When stoves went cold, bricks took their place. Across blackout homes from Warsaw to Rotterdam, families didn't give up on warm food. They adapted. When wood vanished and oil was traded away, people turned to what held heat without fire. Bricks, heated slowly under the sun or placed near extinguished embers, bricks became the new stove. Silent, reusable, and available in every bombed-out building. The method was simple but required timing. During daylight, bricks were laid out to absorb sunlight, on rooftops, in courtyards, near reflective walls. At night, if a fire had been made earlier, bricks were pulled from its edge, still hot but no longer burning. Families placed small metal pots or tin bowls directly on the surface, letting retained heat warm soup, porridge, or even soft vegetables. It wasn't fast. A thin stew might take hours, but it was fuel-free. It didn't need smoke. And in cities where chimneys marked you for surveillance or shelling, cooking without fire was the only way to eat and stay invisible. Bricks were chosen carefully, flat, thick, able to hold heat without cracking. Some households built insulated boxes around the bricks with wood scraps or ash to trap warmth longer. Others layered cloth or sand beneath to prevent heat loss into the ground. Meals were rotated every hour. Pots were stirred every 30 minutes, not to speed things up, but to make sure nothing burned on the bottom and nothing was wasted on the top. The limits were obvious. No frying, no searing, no baking. But for families with nothing else, the slow warmth of a brick gave them more than food. It gave control. You didn't need permission to heat a brick. You didn't need rations or flame. You only needed time and something to protect, and sometimes it wasn't even a full meal, just a mug of warm water with barley, or mashed turnip left overnight to thicken. But the act of heating something, anything, was an act of refusal. A refusal to surrender to the cold. A refusal to eat in silence. If your stove went dead tonight, would a brick be enough? Save this. The next method didn't even need heat at all. Number 2. Haybox cooking. Fire wasn't always an option, but heat could still be trapped when fuel became too precious to waste and families had only one small fire to last them the entire day. Civilians across wartime Europe turned to something older than electricity. Haybox cooking. It didn't require a flame, just insulation, just memory. The method was born from scarcity. A pot of food, usually grains, root vegetables, or stews, was brought briefly to a boil over a controlled fire. Then it was removed immediately, still steaming, and sealed inside a box lined with hay, rags, blankets, or even crumpled newspapers. The box acted as insulation, holding the heat in and cooking the meal slowly, without using another stick of wood or drop of oil. In Poland, families used wooden crates. In rural France, hay-filled baskets. In England, drawers were emptied and filled with wool. The pot was wrapped tightly, often with old coats or layers of cloth, and left untouched for hours. no stirring, no peeking. Heat was survival, and letting it escape meant wasting what couldn't be regained. It wasn't fast. A stew might take 6 hours. A pot of barley, 8, but it worked. The food softened, the starches broke down, and the meal was ready by evening with 0 additional fuel. It required planning, yes, but not power, just heat, trapped and remembered. Limits were real. No high heat browning, no baking. But Haybox cooking had its advantages. It freed up the only fire for something else. Boiling water, drying clothes, warming rooms. It allowed meals to be cooked while families worked or fled. And in areas under occupation, where open flames invited attention, it gave them something precious. Invisibility. Some families built permanent hay boxes in basements or under stairs. Others used bedrolls, hiding pots beneath blankets on sleeping platforms. In refugee camps, the method was reborn in cardboard boxes lined with straw. Wherever it traveled, it preserved more than food. It preserved routine. Because even without fuel, even without flame, haybox meals told a truth too easy to forget, that warmth doesn't always come from fire. Sometimes it comes from what we choose to hold. Could your next meal cook while you wait in silence? Hit save. The next method begins deep underground. Number 3, ash pit steam baking. When open fire became a threat, they cooked underground. In scorched farmlands, frontline villages, and cities under blackout, firelight was a signal, an invitation to danger. Smoke could draw soldiers. Flame could expose your shelter. But families still had to cook, so they buried their heat. They built ash pits, low, silent, hidden cookers warmed by yesterday's embers and sealed by earth. The principle was simple. After a fire burned down, the ash remained warm for hours, sometimes half a day. Families dug small pits near kitchens, cellars, or barn floors. Into the ash, they placed sealed clay pots, metal containers, or wrapped bundles of food. Sometimes they buried the container itself. Other times, they covered it with hot ash, stones, or layers of straw. Then they walked away. No flame, no stirring, no smell, just trapped warmth, rising slowly through layers of earth and memory. The foods chosen were simple. Root vegetables, beets, turnips, carrots, porridge made from cracked wheat or barley, apples wrapped in leaves, soft baked by radiant heat. In some regions, dough was wrapped in cabbage and buried overnight, ready by morning. It wasn't baking in the modern sense. There was no crust, no browning, but it was cooked, thoroughly, quietly, and without risk. In Hungary, farmers turned old fire pits into cooking chambers. In Ukraine, ash pits were hidden in gardens and used at night. In Finland, ash baking became the winter norm, when trees were frozen and smoke marked your roofline like a flare. These meals took time, often 8 to 10 hours, but no supervision was needed, and no fuel was burned. What was once discarded, ash, became the lifeline. It held heat better than stone. It masked scent better than air, and it warned nothing. A meal could be cooking beneath your feet while patrols passed overhead. The limits were understood. Timing had to be learned. Food could oversoften. Moisture could seep in. But those who mastered the method survived without ever lighting a match. It wasn't a recipe. It was a rhythm. Fire at night, ash by morning, food by dusk, and it kept families fed long after the flame was gone. Could you cook in silence? In soil? In ash? Save this. The next method needed no fire at all, just clay, heat, and patience. Number 4, clay pot radiant meals. When fires faded, heat had to be stored, not wasted. In the ruins of farmhouses, basements of bombed cities, and hillside shelters cut off from fuel routes, civilians turned to clay. Not for storage, for survival. Because long after flames died, thick clay pots still held warmth, and that warmth, when trapped, could cook a meal, quietly, slowly, without smoke or sound. This method relied on one thing: thermal mass. Clay, once heated, releases energy gradually. Families used it not just to store food, but to cook it. In Poland, Serbia, and rural Italy, pots were filled during the day. Barley, lentils, turnip mash, then sealed with cloth, lids, or waxed paper. These pots were warmed earlier by residual coals, stove embers, or in the sun, then wrapped tightly in blankets, hay, or even buried in ash-filled crates. No more fuel was added, no flame reignited. The trapped heat inside the pot, combined with insulation around it, slow-cooked its contents for hours. By dusk, the food had transformed. Soft, warm, edible. In a world where every branch, every ounce of coal mattered, this was control. Some families used oven-sized clay containers, repurposed from broken bread kilns. Others relied on smaller pots, insulated with scarves, sawdust, or sand. It wasn't about convenience, it was about memory. They knew how much heat was enough, because they'd seen it passed down, measured not in degrees, but in instinct. Meals were basic. Grains soaked in water, beans pre-boiled, then finished in the warm pot. In some regions, dough was placed in clay jars with apple slices for moisture, wrapped in wool and left to rise and steam softly. No smoke, no searing, just quiet heat, just transformation. But the method wasn't perfect. Food needed to be pre-boiled or partially cooked first. Timing was delicate, spoilage could happen if pots cooled too fast. But the benefits outweighed the risks. No fuel used, no visible fire, no exposure to threat. For displaced families or those in hiding, this technique became essential. One pot fed many. One day's fire worked for the next day's food. And in homes where every resource was counted by the gram, a method that stretched heat itself was priceless. It wasn't just a way to cook. It was a way to preserve the ability to cook, without risking everything. Could your next meal survive without flame? Save this skill. The next method turns rocks into fireless griddles. Number 5. Heated stone griddle method. When metal vanished and pans were gone, they cooked on stone. Not polished slabs or manufactured tiles, just flat river stones, sun-baked field rocks, or chunks of broken masonry. Wherever civilians had no access to stoves, no cooking oil, and no pans, they returned to one of the oldest techniques known to survival, stone griddles. And in the heart of WWII, it worked. Across the Balkan Mountains, rural Italy, and parts of Greece, people searched for flat stones, thick enough to hold heat, smooth enough not to crack. These were cleaned, dried, and placed over coals when available. But more often, they were heated directly under the sun, by residual ash, or near chimneys where warmth lingered. Once hot, food was laid directly on top. This wasn't gourmet cooking. It was tactical eating. Thin slices of root vegetables, turnips, parsnips, potatoes, cut evenly, rubbed lightly with salt if any was left, then placed on the stone to blister and soften. In areas where grain paste or rough dough was made, flatbreads were shaped by hand and pressed directly onto the surface. No oil, no flipping pans, no flames needed. In parts of occupied Yugoslavia, this was the only way bread existed. Stone-cooked discs made from barley or cornmeal. Families learned which stones cracked under heat and which held steady. Some marked the best ones and buried them between uses to keep moisture away. Others embedded stones into outdoor walls to catch sun by day and cook at dusk. But this method had strict boundaries. It didn't boil, it didn't bake, it couldn't handle liquid meals or anything too thick. And without oil, sticking was common. Food lost on the rock was food that wouldn't be recovered. Yet the method offered two critical advantages: no equipment and no fuel. Once the stone was hot, the rest was instinct. And for those with nothing but grain and root, even a slightly charred crust gave satisfaction. A break from boiled mush and cold broth. It gave texture. And when smoke couldn't be risked, it gave something warm, without revealing anything at all. These weren't meals made for flavor. They were made for continuity, keeping food hot in a cold world, without flame, without metal, without waste. Could you cook your next meal with nothing but a stone and sun? Save this method. The next one fed entire blocks with a single sheet of iron. Number 6. Communal iron plate kitchens. When homes lost their heat, neighborhoods shared it, not through charity, but through necessity. In the alleyways of blitzed cities and the frozen courtyards of occupied villages, families who could no longer cook alone formed something stronger: communal iron plate kitchens. These weren't soup lines. They were steel survival, fed by scrap metal, kept alive by rotation, and remembered by everyone who stood in line with an empty pot. The idea was simple. When firewood, coal, and oil could no longer be spared per household, entire streets pooled their resources. Metalworkers, farmers, or scavengers brought salvaged iron sheets, flat, thick, and heavy. These were mounted on bricks, stone, or broken stove frames. A single fire was lit beneath, usually from shared coal or a neighborhood's last rations of kindling. The iron heated slowly, evenly, and once hot, it stayed hot for hours. Each family was assigned a window of time. 10 minutes, maybe 20. A flatbread to cook, a pot to warm, a thin soup to finish. One by one they approached with tins, bowls, and jars, set them down, waited, stirred, and then stepped aside. The iron never cooled, and the queue never ended. In northern France, these iron plates were built into bomb shelters. In Berlin, they were set up in rubble-cleared courtyards, surrounded by windbreaks and guarded from view. In parts of Hungary, they were passed between villages, mounted on carts, kept warm with straw insulation, shared day to day. The food made wasn't complex. Grain mash, warmed lentils, rehydrated cabbage. A scorched onion and barley porridge was considered rich. But this wasn't about complexity. It was about collective cooking under collapse. One fire, one surface, 20 meals. Of course, it wasn't perfect. Not every block had iron. Not every family had something to cook. Fights broke out. Theft happened. But even with scarcity, the plate held firm. Because it had to. It saved fuel. It protected privacy. It allowed people to cook without exposing each roof to the risk of smoke. And for children who stood watching, the sizzle of something on steel, no matter how thin, meant life was still possible. That food could still be shared. That neighbors, in silence, still looked out for each other. Number 7. Boiled grain extension with rainwater. When there wasn't enough to cook, they let time do it for them. In the final stages of war, when wood was gone, fire was dangerous, and rations were down to scraps, many families turned to a slower method of survival. They didn't cook grains the way we know it. They soaked them, extended them, pre-softened them with rainwater, and then finished with only the faintest trace of heat. It wasn't innovation. It was surrender. To reality, to scarcity, to limits that could no longer be argued with. Across occupied zones from Belarus to Belgium, civilians collected rainwater in buckets, basins, or cut-open cans. It was clean, fresh, and didn't cost a thing. Into this water, they poured barley, oats, cracked wheat, or rye. The grains were left to soak for 12 to 24 hours, sometimes longer, until they absorbed the moisture, softened, and began to break down on their own. With no oil to fry and no full flame to boil, families used the last of their coal or shared ember beds to heat the mixture briefly. Just enough to warm, not to cook through. Once warmed, the pot was removed, wrapped in blankets or tucked under sleeping mats. The heat finished what time had started. Some added herbs or salt, if it could be spared. Others dropped in a sliver of vegetable or a piece of crust from yesterday's bread. The goal wasn't flavor, it was weight, bulk, something to chew slowly, something to fill the stomach with as few resources as possible. This method wasn't glamorous, it was slow, blunt, and unforgiving if rushed. Improper soaking could leave grains tough or make people ill, but when done right, it created a porridge that lasted, stretched, and held hunger at a distance. One handful of oats could feed a family of 4 if prepared this way. In parts of Eastern Europe, it became known as night broth. In the British countryside, it was just soak meal. In refugee caravans, it became the morning meal, eaten cold, silently, often shared from a single pot. It didn't rise, it didn't steam, it didn't bake, but it filled, it kept children standing, it gave the body time, and in times when nothing was left, no oil, no fire, no help, grain and rainwater held long enough in patience and cloth were enough. Could your food survive on just time and trust? Save this final skill. What comes next is the memory they left behind. They didn't cook for comfort, they cooked because there was no one left to feed them. No stores, no gas, no help coming over the hill, just hunger sitting at the edge of the table and whatever wisdom hadn't been forgotten yet. They didn't have cookbooks. They had habits, repeated in silence, brick by brick, cloth by cloth, pot after pot, heated not with fire but with patience. They learned to boil without flames, to bake underground, to feed 5 with what today wouldn't fill one. And they didn't complain, because there was no room for weakness when the chimney stood cold and the cupboard was bare. These 7 methods weren't recipes. They were resistance. Resistance against cold, against collapse, against becoming dependent on systems already broken. They boiled grain in rainwater, cooked root in ash, shared a single flame across 20 families, not out of choice, out of memory. Today we forget. We scroll past wisdom. We mock what looks primitive. But the ones who survived, who truly endured, knew that survival wasn't about technology. It was about rhythm, soil, fire, silence. And if we ever face what they faced, we won't have time to search. We'll only have what we already know. So don't let this knowledge vanish again. Subscribe not to watch. Subscribe to remember. Because one day, someone you love might depend on a pot wrapped in hay or a stone set under sun. And on that day, your memory must stand where systems fall. This channel isn't entertainment, it's preservation. Hit subscribe and carry the weight they pass down.